I will admit, a few years ago, I planned a vacation itinerary down to the 15-minute mark. I mean, museums, dinners, transit times, everything was mapped out.
Oh, I can see where this is going.
Right. It was, on paper at least, an absolute masterpiece of personal productivity. There was zero wasted time. But then on the very first morning, a single train was 10 minutes late.
Just 10 minutes.
Yeah, just 10 minutes. But because my schedule had absolutely no slack, that tiny delay meant missing a museum time slot, which, pushed back lunch, which ruined a dinner reservation. The entire 3-day itinerary didn't just bend, it completely shattered.
Well, you designed a system for a version of reality that doesn't actually exist. You designed it for perfection. But the fundamental nature of reality is that it's messy, it's unpredictable, and it is entirely indifferent to our spreadsheets.
That tension between the perfection of our plans and the messiness of reality is really the focus of today's deep dive. We're exploring a pretty counterintuitive concept from our notes on systems thinking, this idea that buffers aren't waste.
Yeah, and it demands a profound shift in how we evaluate the spaces, the time, and the resources we use every day. We have basically been conditioned by modern business practices to look at any slack in a system and automatically categorize it as something to be eliminated.
And we are going to look at the unintended consequences of removing that slack from the systems you and I interact with. Because if you read any standard material on efficiency or look at common best practices in corporate environments, the directive is always identical, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's always less inventory, less time, less redundancy. Eliminate anything that looks like just-in-case capacity.
Right.
The prevailing philosophy behind this is often loosely grouped under the term lean. But there is a massive historical misunderstanding here. When the Toyota production system originally developed what we now call lean manufacturing, the goal was smooth, continuous flow.
They wanted to eliminate unnecessary hurdles.
Exactly. But when Western business schools and management consultants imported those ideas, they often they stripped away the nuance. They mutated smooth flow in zero idle capacity. They started treating any resource that wasn't actively sweating in the current moment as a financial liability.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to push back on those highly educated executives and consultants for a second. These are smart people.
Yes, they are.
They understand risk management on an intellectual level. So why are they so incredibly drawn to stripping systems down to the bone? I mean, why does removing a rarely used backup supplier or, shaving a few spare hours out of an employee's weekly schedule, why does that feel like such a massive, undeniable win for an organization?
It really comes down to the perverse incentives created by how we measure success. Think about the tools managers use to evaluate a system. You've got spreadsheets, performance dashboards, quarterly earnings reports.
Yeah, the metrics.
Right. And those tools are exclusively designed to measure output. They measure what is actively being produced right in this very second, or the capital being saved this quarter. What a spreadsheet fundamentally cannot measure is latent risk capacity. It cannot measure preparedness.
So if I have, say, a backup server sitting idle or an employee with 3 hours of unallocated time in their week, the dashboard simply flags them as being at 85% utilization.
Exactly. To a financial mindset focused on the short term, that missing 15% is just a glaring inefficiency to be corrected.
So we have equated unproductive in the moment with valueless.
We have. And that equivalence is incredibly dangerous. The value of a buffer isn't in its daily output, its value is in its capacity to absorb shock. But because that value is entirely invisible during normal, smooth operations, it is the first thing targeted when someone decides the quarterly margins need to improve.
Let's dig into the actual mechanics of why removing that invisible capacity is so dangerous. Because we aren't just talking about abstract business theory here. There is actual math behind how systems fail.
Oh, absolutely.
The notes we are looking at emphasize a critical perspective shift. Buffers do not exist to make systems faster. They exist to make systems forgiving.
Yes. Forgiving.
Let's look at some specific examples from the source material to ground this, like having more than one person who understands a critical process. Efficiency says cross-training is redundant, right? But resilience says it's essential. Or having a backup supplier that is rarely used.
What's fascinating here is how we misunderstand the very nature of a buffer. It is doing invisible work. When an error occurs or demand suddenly changes, the buffer acts as a shock absorber.
It takes the hit so the rest of the operation doesn't even feel it.
Precisely. If we look at queuing theory, which is the mathematical study of waiting lines and system processing, There is a nonlinear relationship between system utilization and wait times.
Oh, wait, explain the nonlinear part of that. How does the math actually behave?
So imagine a system operating at 70% capacity. If a random delay occurs, the system has 30% slack to absorb it. The delay is barely felt.
Right, there's room to breathe.
Yeah. Even at 80%, wait times increase slightly, but the system functions.
Yeah.
But as your utilization approaches 99 or 100%, the math curve goes exponential.
It just spikes.
It does. At near-perfect utilization, any tiny disruption doesn't just add a small delay. It causes the wait time to approach infinity. The system enters a state of cascading failure.
I always visualize this like a highway during rush hour. If a highway is at 50% capacity, a driver tapping their brakes to change lanes is a non-issue. The cars behind them have plenty of physical space to adjust.
Exactly.
But if that exact same highway is at 99% capacity, packed bumper to bumper, one single driver tapping their brakes creates a phantom traffic jam that ripples backward and lasts for 3 hours.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because the empty space on a highway isn't waste. It is the literal space required for movement. It's like we are looking at an unused umbrella on a sunny day and calling it waste, completely forgetting that its job isn't to make the sun shine, but to keep us dry when the weather turns.
And when you throw the umbrella away to make your hallway look cleaner, you get praised for your optimization skills right up until the sky opens up.
Wow. Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the mechanical consequence is that without shock absorbers, every single minor disruption is immediately passed downstream.
And the real-world consequences of treating a system like a spreadsheet equation are catastrophic. What happens when the buffers are completely gone?
Let's transition to the human impact. What does it feel like to be a person inside this type of system?
That's where it gets really tough. The source material identifies a specific cultural phenomenon that emerges when buffers are removed, which is firefighting.
Firefighting, so just managing constant emergencies.
Yes, without organizational shock absorbers to handle inevitable delays or changes in client demand, every single minor disruption hits the staff directly.
So a meeting running 10 minutes late means the next meeting starts late, which means a core task gets delayed, which means an employee has to stay 3 hours after work on a Friday to fix it. Exactly. The nature of the work fundamentally shifts. You aren't doing the deep strategic work of your actual job anymore. You are simply managing the continuous emergencies caused by the fact that the system has no structural give.
The system has become incredibly fragile because it now fundamentally relies on things going right all the time.
It relies entirely on human heroics to keep it from collapsing.
So what does this all mean? It means that when we think we are designing for peak efficiency, we are often accidentally designing for maximum fragility.
We really are. And we often treat employee burnout as a personal failing, a lack of resilience on the part of the individual. But in a highly optimized environment, burnout isn't a personal failing. It is a mathematical certainty.
A mathematical certainty.
If a person's schedule is mapped out at 100% utilization, they have been engineered into a state of maximum fragility.
Here's where I get stuck, though. I want to look at this from a manager's perspective because the text is very explicit that this is not an argument for excess everywhere.
Oh, definitely not.
Because if I am running a team, it is incredibly difficult in practice to distinguish between an employee who is serving as a vital shock absorber for random emergencies and an employee who's just quietly scrolling social media for 3 hours a day because of poor time management.
Yeah, that is the manager's genuine dilemma. We have to be careful not to swing the pendulum so far that we excuse bloated, poorly designed processes by simply renaming all the waste as beautiful buffers.
Right. This isn't about hoarding unnecessary inventory or paying people to be genuinely unproductive.
Exactly. Some unused capacity really is just waste.
So how do you actually draw the line between a strategic buffer and simple bloat?
The dividing line is conscious risk awareness. True buffers are doing quiet, vital work. They are placed intentionally to protect critical nodes in a system. You maintain a backup supplier, not because you forgot to cancel their contract, but because you have modeled the risk of your primary supplier failing.
Right. Whereas waste is capacity that sits idle without serving any calculated protective function.
Exactly. The danger doesn't lie in removing waste. The danger lies in removing things without understanding the specific shocks they were absorbing.
It reminds me of Chesterton's fence, the old principle that you shouldn't tear down a fence until you understand why it was built in the first place.
Oh, that's a perfect connection.
You look at a department that has been hitting all its targets smoothly for 2 years. You notice a redundant software system or a spare hour in the workflow that hasn't been utilized in all that time, and you conclude it's unnecessary bloat.
Because you fail to realize the department has been running smoothly, precisely because that buffer was sitting there, quietly managing the risk of the unknown.
Yes.
You might have a buffer designed to absorb a specific type of market shock that only happens once every 5 years. But if an incoming executive evaluates the system over a tight 2-year window, that buffer looks entirely like an unjustifiable expense.
They cut it out, the short-term efficiency metrics spike, and they collect a performance bonus.
And then 3 years later, the shock hits and the entire system collapses under the next manager.
It forces us to confront an ultimate trade-off in how we design the world around us. You can have a system that looks perfect on paper, with every resource utilized to 100% and every margin optimized for today, or you can have a system that survives reality.
Perfection and resilience are fundamentally at odds. To be resilient, you must actively choose to accept a certain level of what looks, to the untrained eye, like inefficiency. You have to tolerate the empty space on the highway.
You have to pay the insurance premium of the unused umbrella.
Exactly.
This reframing completely changes how you view the empty spaces in your schedule and your environment. And rather than tying this up with a prescriptive list of action items, our notes leave us with 3 distinct, provocative questions to mull over. We want to hand these directly to you.
These are questions worth holding, not necessarily answering immediately. They require you to step back and examine the systems you interact with every single day.
First, think about your own environment, your workplace, or your personal routines. Which buffers have been recently removed without anyone truly understanding what unseen friction they were absorbing?
Second, look closely at your current operations. Where does your system currently rely on things going absolutely right 100% of the time just to function?
And finally, if you were forced to remove just one more buffer today, what would break first?
True operational resilience isn't found in a system running flawlessly at maximum capacity. It is found in the quiet, invisible spaces we leave behind, just in case things go wrong.